Tonight's speaker, Drew Philp, is a narrative journalist, a narrative nonfiction author. Drew's work has been published nationally and internationally in publications such as BuzzFeed, The Guardian, and the Detroit Free Press, among others. His book, A $500 House in Detroit, Rebuilding an Abandoned Home and an American City, was published in 2017, and I'm sure that's why you're all here tonight. So please join me in welcoming Drew Philp.
Well, thank you so much. My name is Drew Philp. I'm from Detroit. I'm from Adrian, Michigan originally. I'm going to talk for, like 20 minutes or so, show you some pictures of my house and my neighborhood and some things going on in Detroit. I'm going to read a little bit, and then the vast majority of the time will be for you to ask me questions. People generally have lots and lots of questions, so the questions will be at the end. So this is my neighborhood, which is called Pole Town. Has anybody been to like the baseball stadium or the football stadium or seen anything like that in Detroit? Has anybody been to Detroit? It's about a 15-minute bike ride away from the baseball stadium. So this is Pole Town. So this is just east of Eastern Market for you, those of you who've been to Detroit. Like I said, it's about a 15-minute bike ride from the downtown of one of America's major cities, perhaps the heartbeat of America. At one time, this frame and all of these frames would be filled with dozens of houses. Nothing like this has happened anywhere in the United States aside from a war or anywhere else. Again, these would have been filled with dozens of houses. There are two churches on the National Register of Historic Places in the neighborhood, one which is completely abandoned, and the other which is mostly abandoned, and that gets used about maybe once a month. There's a group of former parishioners that are trying real hard to bring that back. But that's how populous and special the neighborhood was. These churches were built to rival the cathedrals of Europe, things like gold leaf and marble. And now just rest abandoned. The neighborhood was originally Jewish. It was Italian after that, Polish after that, who made it what it was, Pole Town, and now it's largely African American. So I come from a pretty blue-collar family. Like I said, I grew up in Adrian, Michigan. My father was a trades teacher in Votech. And I went to the University of Michigan, and I felt very lucky to get the education that I did. The University of Michigan is a world-class school, and I graduated in 2008, which was, of course, the height of the economic crisis. Everyone I knew was leaving the state. I was kind of young and dumb in some ways, and I wanted to use my education for something positive at home. I didn't want to leave when everyone was leaving. I felt really, really good to get this education. I thought I might use it for something at home. I tell people I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew that I wanted to do it in Detroit. So I was making $8.50 an hour sanding floors in these cheap rental houses, and that kind of got me thinking, hey, I should buy one of these houses and it will help keep me in Detroit. It'll help keep me here if I have a house that I need to work on, things like that. But I didn't know how to buy an abandoned house. What's the commission on a $500 house for a realtor? Right, 20 bucks, maybe. So that was out of the question. But one day I went to a Halloween party dressed as an organ grinder, like an old-timey organ grinder, right? And my organ played Motown, which I thought was pretty cool. But I had, I was poor, so I had hidden some liquor inside the organ and went to this Halloween party. I set the organ down to go dance, and I came to get like a swig of this illicit rot gut whiskey, and sitting next to the organ was a man dressed as an organ grinder's monkey. Seriously, it was really kind of meant to be. So we started talking, of course, and I said, I'm kind of new to town. I'd been there for under a year, and I said I wanted to buy a house on the Near East Side, and he said I just did. It was really meant to be. He's kind of a hermit, doesn't go out a lot, so it was very fortuitous. And this was his house, which he let me live in that summer. If you take a look, you can see a telephone pole in the back here. Behind the house was this, giant trash forest where people, largely from the suburbs, would come and dump trash. So one of the things we found back there was that telephone pole. We also found an entire hot tub, and with some fiberglass patch from my grandfather, I patched the hot tub, the holes in the hot tub up. We dug a hole in the ground and made a pond. It was kind of the start to, behind the house in the trash forest also ran an abandoned railroad trench called the Winter Cut, which is now a jogging trail. I could walk my dog, we could walk our dogs back there for an hour and literally not see a soul. This is one of the most important cities in the entire United States. It got me thinking, well, there's something different going on here. We can use some of this stuff, and these challenges as trash is not necessarily trash. At the time, we would ride our bikes around, and that's the portion I'll read to you tonight. We would ride our bikes around looking for houses, kind of ducking into these shells of former homes. And eventually I found this one. Whoops, not that one, this one, here. This was the day we boarded it up. Of course, my friends came and helped me. It was illegal to do so. I was not allowed to be in there because the city owned the house. It was their property. But I, of course, wanted to board it up to protect it from the elements and kind of signal that it was mine before I purchased it. I purchased it in a live auction with a bidder card for $500, obviously, just the namesake of the book. There are some other, there it is, boarded up. And I stopped counting at 10,000 pounds of trash that I took out from the inside. Underneath this pile is a Dodge Caravan van, cut into chunks with a reciprocating saw, literally. The neighbor said it was probably an insurance job. Somebody had needed the insurance money, so they reported it stolen and paid a couple guys to cut into chunks, and it made it into my house. You'll see after pictures of these in a little bit. This is the kitchen, and this is one of the bedrooms upstairs. So, does anybody know what Devil's Night is? So Devil's Night is the kind of annual orgy of arson that used to happen in Detroit on the weekend of Halloween. In some years, the worst years, it is much, much better now. It is, in a lot of cases, the fires are less than a regular weekend because people are looking out. But in some years in the 80s, like I think 86, there were 900 fires in one weekend. So when I purchased my house in 2009, either 1 week or 2 weeks after I purchased the house was Devil's Night. So of course I stayed in my house that night to protect it. And these houses obviously don't just burn a little bit, they don't smolder, they really, really burn. You can feel the heat from blocks away and see the smoke for miles. So obviously, I was not able to live in that house right away with no windows, no plumbing, no heat, and literally filled with trash. So I moved to a very special block in the neighborhood in Poletown, which in my book I call Forestdale. It was kind of started by a man named Paul Wirtz, who was a very, very special man, a brilliant man, who actually just last year found out he was dyslexic, which actually was part of his strength as a teacher. So he was a science teacher at a school called the Katherine Ferguson Academy. The Katherine Ferguson Academy was one of four schools in the United States, one of four public schools in the United States for pregnant and parenting mothers. So while the national average graduation rate for pregnant teens in the United States is about 40%, at Katherine Ferguson it was always above 93%, in part due to Paul's ingenuity. And Paul thought that these young women could not only learn the hard sciences, math and such, but also first learn to raise their children by first raising plants and animals. So Paul started a giant farm on Katherine Ferguson Academy where there were like horses and pigs and chickens. Every young woman got a rabbit to raise. Every young woman got a garden plot when the city finally shut the school down in one of the worst decisions, I think, in a city of terrible decisions, there were a number of women arrested inside the school who would not leave because they loved the school so much. It was heartbreaking to see young women handing their children to their mothers to try to save this school that they had learned so much from. Paul brought a lot of that ingenuity back to his block in Poletown. So you saw, excuse me, you saw those shots of just absolutely no houses. Whoops, this keeps getting ahead of me here. You saw those shots of absolutely no houses. This is in that same neighborhood. There's one block in the neighborhood looks like that. It's Paul's. It's Forestdale, where all the houses are still there. On the house behind Paul's, every house burned to the ground. And instead of letting that fill up with trash and despair, Paul planted a garden. So there's a giant circular garden, which you can see there, which is ringed by fruit trees, and a track as a horse path. In the winter, we flood it for the children, and I mean, if I'm being realistic, us too. The firefighters come help and open the fire hydrants for us, and make it into that. It's an incredible testament to the power of community and the kind of vision of just one person working with a group of other people. So as I mentioned, there were large animals. So to feed those animals over the winter, you need hay. Instead of buying that, Paul took a lot where a school had been demolished 20 years ago and seeded it with hay. All the neighbors get together every year, 2 or 3 times a year, to bale that hay. Does anybody grow up on a farm? Anybody done square baling? Yeah, it's difficult, right? It's heavy, and it's hot. And for free, everybody in the community comes and gets together and does it because it's so weird, right? It's so bizarre. I'll never forget the faces of people like driving through Detroit with like a giant hay wagon, and like, 15 people stacked on top of that as well. There's my dog. This photo is just doesn't have anything to do with the narrative. I just love him so much. I want to show him off a little. His name is Gratiot, which is a street in the city. So this is important. This is a beam down just one block down the street from me is still an abandoned recycling factory. Not a single wall in that factory was left standing. It looked like literally it was in the bombing of Dresden in World War II. So with the chainsaw and with my buddies, I went and there were these big long beams, maybe as long as this room, just kind of laying on these piles of rubble. And I went in with a chainsaw, cut out 16 feet. I think we used 14 feet, and I put it up in my home to hold the roof up. I took out a load-bearing wall and used this as a header. And I include this story for a couple of reasons. One, I like to talk about having our challenges be assets. So one, I'm not having to buy that material. I'm not having to buy it. It's also not going to waste, right? Sitting in this just giant pile of trash. But maybe most importantly, it's saving a little bit of the history of the neighborhood. Right now, we've demolished, I think, 12,000 houses within the last 2 years in Detroit. With that is going all kinds of materials, all kinds of opportunities for jobs to pay young men and women without them in a city that's, some estimates have risen as high as 50% unemployment, to harvest these materials. And we're also losing the history, where we've come from. A lot of people tend to want to sweep what's gone on in Detroit under the rug, and I don't think that's the right choice, because if we do and we don't learn any lessons from now, my grandchildren are going to be in just the same position as I am, and I don't want them to have to live in an abandoned house for 2 years without heat in Michigan winters. So there, of course, we do it Amish style, and everybody comes and helps. That's that community again. There was also, you can see in here, this woman, a Swedish film crew there. This is one of my best friends, Andy Kemp. He was also a teacher at Katherine Ferguson Academy. He was an English teacher. And the film crew was staying at his house, and I really needed his help. He's like 8 feet tall. He's really strong. So I needed him to come, and he said, yeah, sure, you can come, as long as this film crew can come. And I said, whatever. The film crew turned out, the director is named Peter Mettler, and if you lived in Europe, you would absolutely know his name. It's basically like Spielberg. And the film that they made called The End of Time won like the Swedish Best Picture version of the Oscar that year. It's me, just utterly filthy. So one of the things that happened, excuse me, was I lived next to an abandoned house. Up until actually 3 weeks ago, I lived right next to an abandoned house. It was about 3 feet away from my house. I could almost touch it from my bedroom window. That was, of course, a huge fire hazard. If that house burned down, my house was going with it. It was a safety hazard. But it also didn't have any gutters until I put them on. And it ruined my foundation. So I had to dig the foundation out with a shovel. I did it with a shovel. Had my family help come put it back. So this is the result of that. This is a new story, but the city eventually tore down that house, like I said, just a couple of weeks ago. They left the gas on when they tore the house down. So I came back at noon or whatever for lunch just to see how things were going, and you could hear the gas coming out, and you could smell gas for blocks and blocks. And when they came back, they turned my gas off instead of that one. It was a whole nightmare. And that's the finished foundation. So my family came and helped. But people ask me, is this house okay enough to fix? You can fix anything. You can fix the foundation. One of the things that I wanted to do was eat a fresh peach that I grew myself. This is an old picture on this slideshow. And you can see my tiny spindly little trees right after I planted them. But they're all doing pretty well now. And in a couple years, I should be able to eat a fresh peach finally. And here's where we get into some of the after pictures. This is one of the bathrooms. This is like the second bathroom. I hate that picture, so we're going to move on quickly. This chimney I built. It's 37 feet tall. I did not know how to build a chimney before I built it, and people ask, well, how did you do it? And I always tell them the library is free, right? You can learn anything at the library, YouTube, talking to people. These bricks, there was a building just a little bit outside my neighborhood, a couple blocks away from me, that had exploded, and all the bricks were making the street impassable. So with a couple buddies, I waited a couple weeks to see if anybody would take care of it, and when they didn't, I went and got them and used it to build my chimney. These cabinets came from the Chadsey Condon School. It's a story I tell in the book. It's a beautiful school that Detroit was literally tearing down as I was inside with like a crowbar getting this stuff out. The dividers in the stalls in the bathrooms were made of marble. This is old growth oak. You can't get it anymore. Brass light fixtures. They were just tearing it all down. This is all I could get. If anybody's ever had Fago soda, which you're from Michigan, you probably have. These countertops are from the old Fago plant. My buddies went in there with crowbars and got those out before they demolished that. This sink is from a bar which was at the time called Lily's, which is, does anybody know like MC5 or Iggy Pop? Do you guys know who that is? So this was the bar that they got their start. So I'd like to think like one of those kind of like original Detroit hard guys had thrown up in that sink at some point. And remember that room with all the trash? This is that room now. Yeah. Kind of. There's a layer of maple floors over what's underneath that. So yes, they were in the house. They of course got refinished, which I did with the old company that I started working for doing hardwood floors. All right, so I'm going to read from the book just for a few minutes, and then you'll have lots of time to ask questions. Will and I rode our bikes around Pole Town, ducking into wide open shells, not even plywood covering the doors, stepping over broken glass and broken tile and broken dreams. Occasionally neighbors would peer from behind steel-barred security doors, and sometimes they would ask what we were doing. I would explain that I wasn't a scrapper or a speculator, but I was going to fix one of these up and live in it. They would laugh or appear skeptical. To To the best of my knowledge, no one ever called the cops. Call the cops, excuse me. What about that one over there, Will said, riding his bike with no hands and pointing to a duplex that looked smushed in like a pug dog's face. I had 3 goals. I wanted a big kitchen, a chimney for a wood-burning stove, and a large front porch. Having some land around the house for a garden and to insulate myself from any trouble would also be essential. Will hated vinyl siding and what it represented, and his view had rubbed off on me. We would pass by any of those. Condition didn't matter. The duplex Will had pointed to didn't have a porch or space for one. Next. I imagined life in my yet unfound house to be pastoral and wonderful, a life in which I could make most of what I needed, grow a bunch of my own food, and live in a manner I thought responsible. I'd spend my free time woodworking and inventing little contraptions to make life easier. One of my goals was to have nothing plastic in the house, nothing cheap and disposable and made by the hands of children in Asia, nothing with built-in obsolescence, which was ironically invented in Detroit. I'd be self-contained and warm and content. I'd read books by soft desk light and go to work and come home honest and tired. I'd eat a lot of peaches, ones that I grew myself. There was one house we looked at a couple of times. A piece of plywood barely covered the door, and Will peeled it back as I stepped inside. It had a sloped gambrel roof and robin's egg blue paint over clapboard. It was dirty and broken, but seemed friendly, like a cheery home bum, contented with a mellow drunk in the sun. Although this house was just a simple wood frame, like most of the other places in the neighborhood, it was well built. It was also in fair condition for an abandoned house. But each time we would return, more and more of it would have been stolen. First it was the wiring. Then it was the plumbing in the bathroom. The tile was pink and hideous, but the pipes and fixtures were still intact, a rarity in the neighborhood. The tile had been smashed out battering ram style, and the copper pipes and brass fixtures taken. It could have been workable, but was directly next to an occupied house, the only other on the block. What do you think? I asked Will. It's your house, he said, picking up a shard of tile from the ground. He spat on it and wiped it clean with his thumb like an urban geologist. Seems like you could do better. Makes me nervous someone keeps picking it clean. You might have trouble. There were other abandoned options to explore. Next. I didn't think I wanted to buy a house right on Forestdale, although I'd been spending more time there. What was going on was special, but I thought insulated. I wanted to see what life was like for the vast majority of Detroiters who didn't live downtown or any place special, who lived in the sprawling wilderness of the city. There were other places like Forestdale, and I thought I might be able to start something similar, fix up other abandoned houses, and spread the idea, or join something just as tight, if not as colorful and easy to spot. It's kind of like living in a fishbowl, Will said. Everyone knows your business. On the other hand, it's safe and fun. You got to decide what's more important. I also looked into some move-in ready foreclosures, pert brick homes in Detroit's stable and well-populated areas. I could have purchased many of these for less than $3,000. I just couldn't bring myself to profit from someone else's misery. All I could think of were the families once living in these homes and the day the banks and the sheriff put them on the street. Just between 2005 and 2007, 67,000 houses went into foreclosure in Detroit. All right, so this number is different now. This number, we have better information, and 1/3 of houses have been foreclosed in Detroit in the last 15 years. 1/3. It represents a population about the size of Buffalo, New York. It is truly a crisis of refugee and biblical proportions. In addition to that, at least 1/6 of the households have had their water shut off. Detroit, you can spit into the largest source of fresh water on the planet. Fully 20% of the world's fresh water. We cannot even, not that, excuse me, I misspoke. Not that we cannot even, we will not provide water to all of our citizens. We need to think about that as a democracy. Not only did the forced sales leave many homeless, they further decimated Detroit's tax base, one of the crucial factors in the municipal bankruptcy that people had begun to whisper about, but no one thought could actually happen. I decided I wanted a house nobody wanted, a house that was impossible. The city was filled with these structures. It would be only one house out of thousands, but I wanted to prove it could be done, that this American vision of torment could be built back into a home. Fixing it would be a protest of sorts. Will and I laid our bikes in the grass outside a tiny yellow house. It only had half dozen rooms total and was so small the city had no record of it, the property classified as an empty lot. Likely it had been a mother-in-law house, a kind of satellite behind a larger one. It gave me the creeps for no reason in particular. Some of the houses we went into had an eerie feeling, more than the normal unease of stepping into an abandoned home in Detroit, as if some past crime marred the vigor of the place and hadn't yet been washed away by rain and carried into the atmosphere by wind. I felt that way with this one. This is what I'm talking about, Will said. It's so itty-bitty. If you don't buy it, I might get it myself. You could have this fixed up in 2 years. I told myself it wasn't the one because it was on a fairly main street near a bus stop. If lots of people could see progress, it would be incentive to steal the tools that made that progress, an opportunity for the city or police or government in general to poke around. The goal was to be anonymous. Will suggested I could plant pine trees in front of it to obscure the view from the road, but this posed its own problems. You still wanted your neighbors, and only your neighbors, to be able to watch over it. They were unlikely to steal or call the cops, less so for someone passing through. Really, though, it just gave me a bad feeling, and I figured I could do better next. It was during that time I decided I was going to do this the old-fashioned way, without grants or loans or foundation money beginning to pour into the city. I would work for everything that went into the house, because not everyone has access to loans or foundational grants. I could have called the house art, and people would have thrown money at me. It would have been comparatively easy, and I likely would have been able to get more done. But I wanted to prove one man could take a house and make it into a home without someone subsidizing it, like the baseball stadium downtown. If it needed to be done that way, what was the point? What could you prove? It seemed wrong, too, to come into a place, especially one so poor, and suck up all the money. There were people who had been around much longer who could use a roof that didn't leak or plumbing that didn't either. I didn't want any part of that. It would separate me from my neighbors. In the northern part of the city, there's a 6-foot-high concrete wall that runs along 8 Mile Road. It was built to keep black people out of the suburbs. 8 Mile is the historic dividing line between black and white, also the dividing line between the suburbs and the city, the same road made fame by Eminem in his titular film. The wall was built in 1940 by a white neighborhood developer supported by the federal and city governments. When the soldiers returned from World War II, President Franklin Roosevelt, along with Congress, instituted the GI Bill that we generally think of as a law paying for the college education of soldiers. But the bill also built infrastructure and widely expanded federal home loan programs. Coupled with other federal and state initiatives and subsidies, it spurred a house-building boom, the suburban living of the 50s, and ensured the United States would be a nation of homeowners. This all happened in the lifetime of your grandparents, and maybe even your parents or you. These home loans were not available to blacks in Detroit. The same soldiers who fought under the American flag across the world against fascism, Japanese imperialism, and Nazi racism did not qualify for federal home loans because of the color of their skin. In fact, blacks were only allowed to live in a few colored neighborhoods in Detroit, houses and apartments that were widely considered substandard. A typical black dwelling cost 3 times what a comparable place in a white neighborhood would, for half of the amenities. Many didn't have running water, and rat bites on babies were a common problem. The concrete wall was built by a real estate developer attempting to turn virgin land into a subdivision with federal money. Not only were the loans not available to blacks, but they were also not available for development in black neighborhoods. They weren't available for white neighborhoods either, if they contained even one black person. And finally, they were not available for all white neighborhoods bordering black neighborhoods. This process is called redlining because of the color used on maps to denote areas where loans would not be made in any case. Its explicit use has now been made illegal, but the practice continues in many ways. For example, when I moved to Detroit, the only thing on my car auto insurance was my address changed. My auto insurance does not cover theft, so that's not a factor, and my rates doubled. All that changed was my address. Excuse me. The neighborhood, south of 8 Mile, was a black neighborhood, one in which the professional class residents were allowed to purchase land and were building homes without the help of federal loans. The suburban developer was initially turned down for funding because of the proximity to the black neighborhood. His solution was to build a wall, appeasing the civic government managing the federal loans, and ensured blacks would not even be able to see into his neighborhood. The wall is still there today. It is on 8 Mile in Burwood. This is the once great city the newspapers pined for. I figured free money might put me proverbially on the other side of that wall. Anyone who controlled that money, really controlled it anyway, lived on the other side. It wasn't just a demarcation of area and governance, but of wealth and consequently of character. White folks in Detroit had gotten enough free money in the past through subsidies and uneven dealings, so I felt I could leave that for someone else. I wanted, as much as possible, a clean break from the past. Neither was I going to make the banks and bankers any more money by paying their usury on a mortgage. One piece at a time would cut out the middleman and his gleaning of profit for nothing for being wealthy already. I was going to do this the old-fashioned way, through sweat and labor. Work it was, and work I was going to do. Will and I rode past a monstrous white Queen Anne with a wraparound porch. We didn't go in, but I took note. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Does anybody have any questions? Do you think we could turn the lights up? Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a picture of your exterior now that it's redone?
The exterior is not completely redone yet. I need to do that slowly, piece by piece at a time. One, because it's very expensive, but also two, I don't want to do it all at once, and then it becomes kind of a target in the neighborhood. The other thing too is sometimes people like to show up to my house unexpectedly, and that's not something that I'm particularly excited about. Yes?
You say it took 2 years, or are you still working?
So I bought the house in 2009, so it's been almost 10 years. And yes, I'm still working on it. The inside of the house is obviously very nice. It's basically mostly done. There's a little bit of sheetrock that still needs to be done. People ask, like, how long is it going to take you to stop? So my grandfather built his whole house, his own house. He's 93 years old, and last year we moved a knee wall for him 3 feet. So based on the experience of my family, my father, my uncle, I'm probably never going to be done with the house. Yeah, in the back here, as many people as possible.
1,000 homes have been...
Approximately.
Homes, okay.
That's the best guess. I don't know how well the records are.
Do you have any idea how many more homes there are that probably...
So part of the problem in Detroit is the data. We don't really know. And that kind of changes all the time. I don't even think I can give you a good estimate on that. But the best estimate in this kind of house tearing down boom is about 12,000. And that's aside from the things we talked about. These materials I think could be harvested, could create jobs, could be used to build the housing stock in the city. One thing about Detroit is we have a housing crisis right now. So in Midtown and downtown, occupancy rates are about 97%, which is huge. People are having a difficult time finding houses, and prices are really going up. But the other thing it's done, because so much of these houses were built with lead paint, the lead levels of children in Detroit are extremely elevated because all that lead goes into the atmosphere, and these young people breathe it. In addition to that, there are 48 schools in Detroit where the students cannot drink or use the water because of lead right now. So Flint is not the only place. We're kind of getting into this compassion fatigue where people can't keep up with all of this stuff. Yes, sir?
How many square feet is your
I have no idea. The question was about how many square feet are in my house. And I don't know because I didn't buy it from a realtor, right? So I have no clue. The other question people often ask me is how much money did it take? This is an answer I don't know the answer to this one either, because I didn't do it without a loan or any grants or anything like that. I literally would get a paycheck. I did all kinds of stuff. I was like a chef. I wrote sometimes. I worked a number of years teaching young men in prison, life skills, English. I taught people how to read in there sometimes. I would get my check every 2 weeks, and I'd immediately go to Lowe's and buy, stuff, even if I didn't need it right now, so I couldn't spend that money on something stupid, which I would have, and got these materials. So I don't know. I'm not sure. It had 6 bedrooms at one point. It now has 3 because I changed 2 into a giant office for myself, and I was like, oh, I'm going to write in there. It's going to be great. Now I kind of just play video games in there and lay on the couch. And then another one, this room was technically a bedroom, I think. Yes, ma'am.
The windows, doors, and your woodwork, was that from other places?
So this door, for example, I found in that giant pile of trash. Obviously, it was covered in paint, and that paint was like lime green and silver. It was like weird and awful. This trim was up there, which was also painted, obviously, and got all stripped. So some of that stuff was in there. You know, a lot of the things like was a big deal for me to try to recycle a lot of this stuff and at least provide some kind of example for how this could be done, potentially on a larger scale. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have neighbors?
I do. So my block is pretty populated. It once had 12 houses on it, and now I believe there are 3 occupied houses on the block.
Were you well received by the neighbors?
Yeah, I mean, initially people were pretty wary, and I was pretty wary of people too. I didn't know what to expect. I'm obviously a white man. And moving into a neighborhood that is not necessarily historically black, but is currently black. It's really hard to hate your neighbors when you see them working out there every day. Many of my neighbors were very, very receptive and are wonderful, great people. I really, really love my neighbors. The thing, when people come to Detroit now from out of town, say like, I didn't know a city could be this nice. People are so nice. People say hi to you on the street. You know, it's part of being Midwestern, but there's an extra little part of that in Detroit. So yes, I do have neighbors. And you know, initially people were wary, but now we have a great relationship. You know, one of the reasons is because we have to. I had a person break into the abandoned house next to me just a couple of months ago. And I was laying in bed with my girlfriend. And I had to, of course, do something about that. So I went over there. I told the person he had 3 minutes to leave. I assume it was a he. 3 minutes to leave. I'm going to go back to my house. You can get out of here, and we'll take care of it like that. That happened. One of my other neighbors, just down the street from me, called the police. You know, I had my gun. And she said, you know, I don't call the police for a number of reasons. And she said, you know, we should call them just so you're safe in case you have to defend yourself. And then, so I talked to the police. They said, we'll be there in 5 minutes. The police never showed up, which is typical, right? The police, of course, never showed up. So we have to look after each other and protect each other. I tell people, you know, what keeps me safe is not really my guns. What keeps me safe is my relationship with my neighbors, because we all look out for each other. These are good, hardworking, blue-collar folks. And I really, really love them. So, yeah. Yes, sir?
On page 159, you compare Detroit to a child's chemistry set.
Yes, in a lot of ways. So what that was in reference to was there's a lot of, oh, excuse me, you're right, I'm sorry, thank you. I made a reference to Detroit as a child's chemistry set, in not a pleasant way. There's a lot of experimenting going on in Detroit right now, in many cases by young people, white people like myself. So it sometimes feels living in Detroit now like being smeared across a slide under a microscope, because there are so many studies, and they suggest things like shutting off entire neighborhoods like mine to city services. No fire protection, no trash pickup, no updating of the infrastructure, and things like that. And obviously, people think that's insane, think that's not a good idea. People always tell me, you know, well, there's one house on the block. Why should we provide that? Well, I grew up in the country. I grew up in Lenawee County, in Adrian, Michigan. And in many cases out there's one house every mile. And we give them electricity, right? The fight for rural electrification in the United States is a big deal. So if we can do one house a mile, we can also do one house a block. Because do you think, in, again, one of the largest cities in the United States, they're going to just let that land lie fallow and keep that shut off forever? No, once the people are out, they're going to say, oh, we have a new plan for it. Let's build a mall. Now all the people had to leave, right? And they didn't have to pay, pay a fair wage for that. People in my neighborhood especially remember the Poletown plant. Does anybody remember the fight over the Poletown GM plant? It was in the 80s, it was a big deal, some people in the back. That was in my neighborhood. So with that plant, they destroyed the top half of Poletown. They kicked like 4,300 people out of their houses to build it. 400 small businesses, 40 churches. Inside the plant now is a Jewish cemetery. I've been in it. It is wild. Because by law, they couldn't move this Jewish cemetery, so they literally built a plant around it. And it's open on 2 days a year for the people in there to visit their relatives. That plant, like I said, it kicked about 4,300 people out of their homes to build it. Never employed more people than were kicked out of their homes to build the plant. It's a huge mistake, in my opinion. It was one of the most racially diverse neighborhoods in Detroit at the time, and one of the strongest. So I think we need to think a little bit further ahead. People also ask me, what I want to have happen with Detroit, what's my vision? And I always say, the only failure will be trying nothing new, right? We need to try new things here. This is America. I grew up understanding this spirit of innovation that goes on. And now sometimes we're just stuck still giving hundreds of millions of dollars to billionaires to build sports stadiums. It's not working. Try something new. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
You say, someone says on the back of your book that this is a glimpse of a way forward for generations to come. One of the reasons I'm here tonight is because it seems to me might help us in Kalamazoo work with some of our homeless situation problems. What is your idea about that?
I think it's great. So the question is, is this possible in other places? And I think yes, absolutely. It's not just Detroit that this is possible in. It's places like Muskegon, like Kalamazoo, Lansing, where my sister. I have family in all these places. This is why these are on the top of my head, right? Absolutely. I think that we need to think about, what it means to tear 12,000 houses down instead of surgically dismantling them. Or thinking about hey, let's start a program. It takes $12,000 to demolish a house in Detroit, approximately. What could we give us, a young person or someone who's having a hard time, a young family that's been foreclosed? Could we give them that $12,000 and the house and help them get their start on rebuilding that? Makes a lot of sense to me. You're not going to have 100% success rate, but who cares, right? What do you get for demolishing these places? That's just one example, right? We can tessellate this example to all kinds of stuff. So one thing I always talk about is just a week after Detroit declared bankruptcy, supposedly Detroit had no money. Along with the state, we gave Mike Ilitch $400 million to build a new hockey stadium. So Detroit had no money. That wasn't a tax break. That was a giveaway. We literally gave him that money. So people ask, what we could have done with this money. One idea is to plant fruit trees around the city. Detroit is year to year often the most obese city in the United States for a complicated set of reasons. One of them being access to healthy food. Plant fruit trees around the city, hire people to take care of them for the next 100 years of the life of the trees, and let everybody eat from that for free. You could have put solar panels or geothermal heat in the vast majority of occupied houses in Detroit for that price, right? Give everybody free heat or free lights. It would have been a huge deal. If you want to keep it in the realm of capitalism, you could have split that $400 million into $800 $500,000 small business grants and loans. $500,000 is a lot of money to start a small business. And what would Detroit look like with 800 new small businesses instead of one stadium that he could have built anyways, right? There's a lot of, these are just, these are, it's not that hard, right? The difficult part is getting our politicians to do what we want, because I don't have all that much money. I don't know if anybody's a billionaire in here, but it's hard to compete when our politicians are getting, in many cases, millions of dollars from giant corporations and things like this. I grew up in Adrian, Michigan. We're having a real problem with heroin right now. I don't know if that's going on here too, but in my home, it is. There was one kind of overdose death during my entire childhood. Now it's one a week. something absurd, make this one a month. Sometimes there's 2 in one day. You know, and that came with the pharmaceutical companies pumping the synthetic heroin into these towns. You know, in West Virginia, I did a story about a county where there were more pills prescribed in the county by a factor of 1,700 than people that lived in that county. The hard part, I don't think, is the ideas. If we have the will, there's a way. The hard part is getting that money out of our politics and getting our politicians that do things that work for us. Yes, sir.
I'm trying to get a picture of the area, like when you're showing your first photos, and there's a lot of grass and
Sure.
open space. It seems like what you did kind of started a wave, or were there other people of like mind doing what you were doing?
Yeah, so the question is about other people.
Especially in that particular
Sure.
area of where you live.
Sure. The question is about other people of like minds doing a similar thing. So I did not start the wave. Paul Wirtz is one person. Paul didn't even start the wave. There were other people. I was standing on the shoulders of giants, like that man I mentioned before, Andy Kemp. He had totally redone a house on Forestdale. I was able to use their knowledge because I've written about it and because I've been speaking and been very public about that. Yes, many more people have also done that. I know at least of a dozen people that as a direct result of what I've written have moved to Detroit and bought their own houses. So yes, but I don't want to seem like, oh, I'm like the first person that has done this, because I'm not. I'm definitely not.
So is the neighborhood where you live, are there houses now, whereas before it was mainly just one house every?
No, it's people have bought these houses. The neighborhood is still extremely empty. Poletown has a population density 90% less than Detroit, which is already a half-empty city. Yes, ma'am.
Have you done any research on the history of your home?
A little bit, yeah. So I was helped by a professor at the University of Michigan who had access to the census records. And it is tracked pretty much with the neighborhood. So a Jewish family lived there originally, Italian family, Polish families, and then black families, and then it was abandoned. Those people were likely like kind of middle class folks that worked in some kind of manufacturing through that time, like foremen, people like that. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Could you explain the process in the city? So you have all of these abandoned houses, and then they just sit there, or how did you know there was an auction, and who held the auction? Is that the city
Sure.
auction? Or?
The question is just about the process of the abandonment. So yes, at the time, there are less in the neighborhood now because the city is really tearing all these abandoned houses down. I could throw a stone in any direction and hit an abandoned house. The city, it was not the city, it was a county auction in our Michigan state constitution, or it's not in the constitution, it's a law, it's just a regular law, that says these tax foreclosures have to be sold at auction. I'm sure someone in the neighborhood, or one of my friends, a part of my community, told me about this auction, and that's where I learned about it. They had a book. At the time, it's online now, and people from China, for example, are buying huge swaths of houses in Detroit and letting them sit. And it's not just China, it's people from Texas and also Michigan too, that are really, in my opinion, trying to profit off this misery. And in the meantime, I have to live next to an abandoned house. The abandoned house next to me for years was owned by an LLC that I could not get in contact with because of the laws had been built to shield them. So yeah, I'm sure I found out by that this auction was going on by one of my friends, but the house didn't even have an address. So I walked down to what's called the GIS office in City Hall, and I brought them a little hand-drawn map of the streets that it was between, and they made me a parcel map, and the guy there was like, dude, you're gonna have to pay $100 for this unless you tell me you're a student and are doing this for a project. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm a student, thank you. And then I got that book, and I found it, I found the property in the book with the lots next to it, and I went to the auction and bid on it.
Is there like a way of finding information from your neighbors or those neighborhoods? Like if I don't know how to put the door on,
Sure.
to help each other do stuff stuff like that? Or?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's how the society has worked forever. The question is about finding information about how to do this from your community. And like this is how human beings have done things for literally since they've been human beings, right? We're social animals. There's also YouTube right now. YouTube is a great resource. You can learn anything on YouTube because people just put it on there and you can learn it. Like every time I need to fix my truck, I go on YouTube and they'll tell me exactly how to do it. So there's no like official resources that I can think of. A lot of it is word of mouth, and that's I think part of the problem. However, it's just in that relationship with your community. Yes, in the back there.
My question is, I'm kind of not really understanding your position or what the benefits are. You sound like you're against them tearing down houses, but then you made the comment about the house next to you being abandoned and that finally it was torn down because then it's not a fire hazard.
Sure. I tried to buy that house for 7 years, and I could not because it was owned by a limited liability corporation. Right? I would have fixed that house up and put my cousin in, who coincidentally lives here, or rented it out, done something with it, but I couldn't do it. What I'm advocating for is responsible, intelligent policy around demolitions in Detroit, and just in terms of around thinking of just in the United States in general, our policies of environmental policies and employment policies. I would have much rather liked to see that house surgically dismantled and use the materials for that house for something positive in Detroit. Before they demolished it, I went in there and got out everything I could, which was also illegal. And if I got caught in there with a crowbar, they could take me to jail for breaking and entering. It did happen to a very good friend of mine, a person that's in the book. He had boarded up a school. And he was like just happened to be driving by someday, and there were some scrappers scrapping it out. And so he like went in there and chased him out. And then he saw a cop going down the street, so he flagged the cop down. And the cops were like, "Were you just in there?" And he was like, "Yeah." I boarded it up, and they took him to jail. And he was stayed in jail for 3 days until like all the preachers in town raised a little hell and got him out. So I would have much rather seen that house dismantled in a responsible way, and all of the houses in Detroit dismantled in a responsible way. I think we could create thousands of jobs having people take care of these things. Like I said, I've been living next to that house for a decade. Yes, sir. Excuse me, in the back here, but he's had his hand up for a while.
You're starting to talk about what's rebuilding community, neighborhood by you.
Pardon me?
Is anything rebuilding the neighborhood a sense of community? You spoke to having good rapport with some of your neighbors. What's making it feel a little broader sense that here's where people would want to live?
So the question is about community, and so what I found when I lived there, so when kind of capitalism moved back from Detroit, it left a big vacuum, right? Detroit was industry, cars, the Motor City that put the world on wheels, things like that. And when that all left, there was a big vacuum there. What that was filled with was community, and I think it's very special. I did not start that. Paul Wirtz did not start that. That was something that's been going on for a long time there, especially the struggle for African American self-sufficiency, which is really important. That's been going on along there. What's happening now is there's a struggle, in my opinion, between this kind of these ideals of community and money. I think this is a struggle that's been going on a long time. One of the reasons I read about Detroit is because it's very easy to see there, in my opinion. There are people that are, I'm not the only one that's understood Detroit is cheap, right? There are lots of people coming in to try to profit off of what's going on. And there are other people who've largely been in the city for a long time, and many who are coming in, that understand that we need to live in a different way in the United States. And in our world in general, not just our country. We need to live in a different way, and that starts on the local level. Yes?
You say anger can keep you going?
Sure. The question was about anger can keep you going. Yes, I think absolutely. Anger is a motivating emotion. It's also, it can be destructive, right? And not helpful, but I'm very angry about what I see. A third. I don't know how else to say this to people. I've been banging my head against the wall trying to get people to understand this for years. A third of the city has been evicted. That's insane. It's a city the size of Buffalo, New York, that's been kicked out of their homes. It's incredible. It's the reason I wrote this book. It's the reason I come to places like this and talk about it, because that is a huge, huge problem that we're letting that happen here, and we're letting it happen. Yes, sir.
A couple of years ago, I saw a video about a fellow who purchased, I think it was about 200 vacant lots, and he wanted to grow an urban farm, but the soil was too contaminated, so he built a forest. How far away from that, is that forest still growing?
Yeah, so so this question is about a man named John Hance, who originally came to my neighborhood and wanted to use a lot of that space for a giant urban farm. This man is a banker. He's a millionaire. He made his money in banking. We had a lot of community meetings about it in my neighborhood, and we decided we did not want that. The vast majority of my neighbors thought this was simply a land grab from this man, where he could get lots and lots of Detroit land, and for I think it was $1 a parcel. It was like a dollar for each parcel. So the neighborhood didn't want that, so we told him to scram. At further east of my place, he was able to get that land. And he planted not vegetables, but hardwood trees. The jury's still out on that one. We'll see what happens. He was able to get it for very inexpensive, when in many cases, many of the urban farmers, like the small scale people, can't get the land that they want. So many of the urban farmers are very upset with him. And we'll see what happens. Will those trees grow to maturity, and will he log them? And then what's going to happen? Like I said, many of the people in my neighborhood thought that was simply a ruse for him to get land with this kind of green smoke screen of a farm. Yes, sir.
The land surrounding your area, is that at all available through the city or private holders?
The question was about the land in my area, if it's available, and largely right now, no, it is not. Because the city is trying to hold on to that land. Much of it's owned by the city, because we think they're getting ready for development, right? If like people like me, like small scale people own it and like want to do like urban farms, well, like the tax money from urban farms isn't a whole lot. It does nothing for your buddies if you're a politician to have an urban farm there. So they're really holding it down on lockdown. One thing that has been floated is we live next to Eastern Market, and they'd like to make the market more residential for young white people moving in, and then move all the kind of slaughterhouses and things like that into my neighborhood with the truck traffic and such. Yes, ma'am.
What are we seeing through the windows?
That's my fence, and the question was, what are we seeing through the windows? That's my fence, and that's like the top half of a wood shed. There's a lot of ash trees in Detroit. A lot of ash trees were planted a number of decades ago, and because of the emerald ash borer, which is a parasite that attacks the tree, basically all of those trees are dead. They fall down, like in some cases across the road, and sometimes the city doesn't do anything about that. So me and my buddies go out there with our chainsaws. We cut these trees up and we use them for firewood. Yes, sir. I see you, Ben.
How did you handle concerns about stripping your wood for lead paint and all that?
How did I handle concerns about stripping my wood for lead paint? I smoke cigarettes, so I just plan on living a short life. I'm 30. It's not clean or healthy to do. I remember one of the bottles of stripper that I got. I usually scrape it with a knife, and I think that's a little bit better. But one of the bottles that I got from this old Polish hardware store. All the hardware stores have been gentrified out of the neighborhood at this point. There's not a single one left. Anyways, that bottle was black and had a skull and crossbones on it, like old school. It's like, maybe I should wear gloves for this one. So yeah. Yes, sir.
Okay, if the ash trees are getting knocked out and the city doesn't want to plant trees, on the city side down the whole block, can't you just plant apple trees pear trees and whatever you want.
Yeah.
And when they grow, you would have all that fresh produce for local markets. And when I was down in Florida, all the apples were from Michigan.
Sure.
So it's a big win-win if you get those apple trees. There are many varieties.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, that's a part of the reason I planted those trees in my lots, right? I got 4 peach trees, 2 pear trees, and 2 cherry trees. Yeah, I mean, absolutely, right? The other thing it does, so there's a professor from Michigan State University named Michael Ham, who calculated that Detroit could grow 75% of its vegetables for the city, in the city itself, and half of the fruit that the city would need itself. What that also does, I mean, that's good for the city, right? You're dealing with obesity, things like this. What it also does is you use a lot less gasoline trucking tomatoes down the street than you do in from Mexico, right? It begins to reduce our reliance on not only foreign oil, but oil itself, right? We have time for one more question, I think, right? Yes? Yes?
What is your outlook on the city of Detroit?
Oh, in what way?
Optimistic, pessimistic? I grew up in one of the Detroit suburbs, so
Sure.
I've seen it get really bad.
Sure.
And my parents, who still are living in the same place, think it's heading up, but it has a long way to go.
It does. It does have a long way to go. That's a hard question. When people talk about like Detroit coming back necessarily, I always ask, what are we coming back to? Are we coming back to this kind of segregation and these walls and this reliance on motto industry and money? People in my generation especially are looking at things like climate change that we absolutely have to deal with. There's no other option for us. We have to deal with that. There was just a report that came out, 10 years. We got 10 years to deal with it. I think that starts locally. As I said earlier, I see a tension between people kind of wanting a different way to live and wanting to experiment with that, and the old ways of doing things. The old ways of giving billionaires $400 million to build a hockey stadium instead of investing that in renewable energy or something like that. Right now I see a tension between those things. And I can't say whether or not which one is going to win. My opinion, I try to be on the side of folks that are trying something new. So, thank you very much for your time. I'm going to use the restroom real quick, and then I will be in the back signing books. So thank you so much. And I appreciate you guys coming out. It's so cold. Thank you.